You're listening to the Coffee Podcast. This is the Coffee Science Series, Fermentation. Our guest for a discussion on coffee fermentation is Lucia Solis, a prominent fermentation expert in coffee with a scientific background in viticulture and enology, the cultivation of grapevines and the study of winemaking. Lucia had a lot of lab experience making wine and worked for a company called Scott Laboratories, a wine yeast supplier. She was responsible for buying yeast and finding all the elements they needed for winemaking. They had the idea of expanding the use of wine yeast, not only for breweries, but also into the coffee and cacao sectors. Lucia did the trials for them, so she traveled and trialed the yeast on coffee farms. She would document the results of those tests.
At that point, it was really much like research and development, but it wasn't necessarily, scientific. It was really for understanding this process better in coffee and for the ultimate goal of selling yeast. So it wasn't, at a university. So I thought that was an interesting idea, and I started traveling for them in 2014, going to mostly Central and South America, to different coffee farms, bringing, 10 different strains of yeast and just trying out different fermentations and seeing what worked. And then from some of that information, they had other people doing it in other parts of the world, maybe like one other person that was doing it. And we were just trying to collect this information to see how did this work in real life. And based on that, they went on to develop, now I think there are 3 commercial strains for coffee specifically.
Wow,
so
okay,
it started with like a wine base, and then it was evolved into being very much specifically for coffee.
Fermentation is very new to me personally, understanding it at all. Part of the reason you're here is to help me understand this better and our listeners. But that process of introducing yeast, like what's the time frame on that as far as like, you bring the yeast and you're testing it, how long does that take to get results?
Very, very short. It's very similar to the process of making bread, where you have a starter packet that you can buy at the store and you can add it to your dough. And then you have a loaf of bread, and then you can taste it, however long it takes you to bake it. So it's really as long as that process it can be for coffee. So if we have a coffee fermentation that's 12 hours, we can add this culture of yeast, do a 12-hour fermentation, and then I guess at that point you would need to wait for the coffee to dry and if you can roast it, and then see how the flavor develops. But we were really looking at just making sure that the fermentations were complete and robust, meaning that they completely removed the mucilage, that there weren't any off odors. So in that way, you can see success, within those 12 hours. And
Amazing.
Then the flavor component can come later.
I'm already learning something here. In my head, fermentation is a process. And so I'm thinking this is going to take a while for some reason. That's like, maybe because I'm thinking of like fermenting pickles or like throwing that's not really the same thing, but
well, in a way it is. And I think that's one of the things to clarify is that fermentation is like this really big catch-all word, and people use it in different ways. And so the way that I'm trying to use it is in terms of processing coffee. That fermentation could be as short as 12 hours or it could be as long as 100. It can go on for a really long time if you have a lot of mucilage, or maybe you're supplementing by adding even more a different sugar source. So I think that if your goal is to only remove the mucilage, that can happen really quickly. I mean, in a very hot environment, maybe that can be 6 hours. It can be very, very quick. Wow. And in some places it can take a very long time, and that's also more stylistic. If you're trying to, if the weather is really cold, if you're trying to achieve a specific outcome. So I think that's one of the biggest questions I get is, when is a fermentation done? When is it over? And that's a really hard question in coffee because it depends what you're trying to achieve. Whereas in wine, it's a very simple answer. The answer is when all of the sugar in the grape juice is converted to wine. That's when you're done, when all of the sugar is gone.
Sort of a rigid definition of when it's done versus coffee sounding like it's a little more open-ended, maybe more of a variable you control for an outcome you're going for, maybe. Is that?
Exactly.
Oh, wow. Okay. Cool. Well, I love that we're already diving into the words here. But let's take a few steps back because I do want to talk about defining our terms. You've made this point eloquently on your podcast, Making Coffee, which listeners, go check that out. I want to bring it up here because it plays a major role here in the conversation around coffee science, in the overall series that we're doing. Do you believe vocabulary matters in coffee, and why?
Well, I would, like you said, kind of even stepping further back, I think vocabulary matters in life, not just in coffee. I think it matters in everything that we do because we can only be as precise as the words that we use. And in specialty coffee, it's a very young industry, and we're creating the coffee jargon now. We're developing it as we speak. And so far, I think that we've been doing a really poor job of describing what we want to be describing and you know, combining some terms, trying some things out. Like, I don't think that a lot of people realize how unscientific a lot of the words that they use currently are.
Yeah. Yeah. Guilty, by the way, over here. Let's talk about defining something very basic here. You know, we did it forever ago. It would probably have been episode 1. I love your emphasis on coffee being a fruit. And you sort of blast the idea of coffee being called a bean, which I appreciate. Can you explain your thinking here and give us your definition of what coffee is?
Yeah, I have to be careful sometimes because I'm speaking from a position of trying to represent science and being an advocate for science. There are some places where I am talking about defined scientific terms and defined scientific standards. But I also get to have my opinion. So there are some things where I want to clarify, like, this is my personal opinion from my observations versus I'm speaking as an advocate of science.
Mm-hmm.
And when I speak about coffee as a seed, that's not my opinion, right? It's not my opinion that it's not a bean. That is the botanical anatomy of this fruit that we drink as a beverage. And so there's both this idea that, okay, so what? Like, most people do think that maybe they start to realize that coffee is a fruit, but bean is just a really easy word to say. It's just, I even find myself kind of falling into saying coffee beans. And I think it's okay to refer to the coffee bean as a bean after roasting. Once it's been transformed, I'm a little bit more loose in that sense. But when we're talking about green coffee or anything before that roasting step, I really like to think about it and be very militant and in my thinking, and then in talking to other people, that it's a seed. Because when we don't think about it as a seed, then it's sort of like it's a way for the conversation to stop. If it's a bean, then that's all that you can do. But if it's a seed, if it's like the precursor, if it's the beginning of this botanical plant, then there's all of the things that we do before it matter. So how much water it gets, how much sunshine it gets, where it's grown, what are the nutrients, how is the soil amended, how are the plants treated at the farm? All of those questions can kind of come into the forefront.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of the times when people think that it's a bean, their curiosity tends to stop there. And not that beans aren't also a plant that is grown, but that curiosity doesn't seem to continue when we just think of it as a bean. So that's why it's really important for me to just have that distinction and remind people that it's a fruit and that you're drinking the seed of a fruit.
I find this conversation really helpful in understanding coffee more. And the thing that I have to compare to right now, I'm studying data science, and one of the conversations that comes up is the concept of linear regression, which we're not going to get into, but the idea is that, like, a physicist and a mathematician and a data scientist all have a different use for linear regression, but they all have this perception and what it's for, and they view it from a different angle. But at the end of the day, like, the actual thing itself has to be defined by what it actually is. And I find that helpful in coffee because we're all standing at different points of the handoff of what coffee becomes. And for me, it's really helpful to think, like, there's purpose in seeing it differently, and there's purpose, or there's there's value you can derive from it at different stages that are going to be different for people standing at different positions. Anyway, all that to say, us starting with the fact that it's a seed, I think really refreshes the conversation on the podcast about, where, not just what is coffee, but where does it come from? And it has such a rich connection to the hand of the producer, or even, before that, like the seed and where it comes from. And
I really appreciate that in terms of having that fresh kind of reset that we're talking about. Like language can do that for us, where if we've been using the same words, we kind of get into these like ruts of mental thinking. But if we allow ourselves to have new language, then that new language opens up these new possibilities of looking at the same thing that we've already been looking at, but we get that fresh eyes, that like beginner's mind. And that's something that I really value. So that's why I think, the words are really important, and they can help us have this beginner's mind.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's have a beginner's mind about the next word to define here, the trendy topic of this episode, fermentation. I'm going to start with, what is fermentation not? If that's me, hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, I think this is a really great way to start. A lot of the times I like to think about, what things aren't, because sometimes topics are so big. So if we can just kind of agree on what it's not, we can from the outside start to narrow in, instead of, trying to come in from the inside and broadening out and kind of losing that center.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really great place to start. And the first place I want to start is, I disagree with the notion that fermentation is trendy. It is one of the oldest methods of food preservation. And I agree that it's trendy in regards to the coffee conversation. But what I think is trendy is that we're actually paying attention to a process that has been going on for hundreds of years. So fermentation isn't trendy. It's just our attention to it, or our interest in it, is trendy. But the fermentation has been happening the whole time without you.
We just haven't been at the party. We've been like, oh, we made it to the party finally.
Yeah. So I think that's the first thing. What it's not is, it's not new. I also don't think that it's trendy. I think that it's also not a silver bullet. I think for flavor and for coffee quality, I think that because it's getting so much attention, there is this misconception that all you need to do is have a 60-hour fermentation and you will be great. Or if you add these yeast, or you have this bacteria, that you could really improve your coffee. And that's true a lot of the time, but there's many other cases where that is really going to be very minimal help. And there's a lot of other things that coffee producers could tackle first. So not trendy, not new, not a silver bullet. One thing I want to clarify a little bit is that, I don't think, well, let's see. This is both my opinion, but I think science would back me up significantly on this, is that coffee is not a fermented food in the traditional sense of fermented foods being wine or beer or sourdough or cheese or kimchi or sauerkraut or kombucha, kefir, yogurt. All of those products are fermented foods, in that the original material, so the grape juice, becomes the wine. The milk becomes the yogurt or the cheese. That initial product is transformed. In coffee, we have this situation where we're one step removed, because the thing that is fermented is the mucilage on the outside, but the thing that we drink is the seed. So we ferment the outside and then wash it away, throw it away, and then we roast the seed and drink that. And clearly there is some impact of that outside fermentation into the seed. I mean, otherwise I wouldn't have a job. But we're not actually consuming the thing that is fermented. There's a passive exchange from the outside of the mucilage into the seed, like a passive diffusion of those compounds, like you would, marinating meat. You have to wait some amount of time for the spices and the herbs on the outside to infuse the meat with that particular flavor. So this is why I like to say that coffee is not traditionally a fermented food, even though it undergoes a fermentation process.
Wow. So we've identified what it's not. Can we get a little more fine-tuned into what it is?
One more thing that it's not a process, because what it is part of every process. And by process, I mean your washed, your honeys, and your natural, your dry process, because all of those processing methods have an element of fermentation to them. Because fermentation isn't a process, it is a metabolic activity. So it's how microbes like yeast and bacteria get their energy.
Okay.
So it's a new way to use fermentation. I think that's one roadblock that a lot of people come to in coffee, in that fermentation has been used as a word to describe a step in processing, meaning you harvest the cherries and then you ferment them and then you roast them. And so it's just like anything that happens between that, between the harvest and drying and roasting, is fermentation.
Mm-hmm.
And so traditionally a lot of people thought that fermentation only happened in a tank, and they weren't necessarily considering honeys that dried on a raised bed or naturals on a patio. They
Mm-hmm.
weren't necessarily considering those a fermentation, but they do undergo fermentation, because when we redefine it, as science does, as a metabolic activity, then those yeast and bacteria are present in those other processes as well. So that's one of the things, is breaking the concept that fermentation only happens in a tank and doesn't happen in other places.
So if I am, I don't know, like a green seller or an importer, and I'm selling coffee, and I throw lactic on a bag of coffee because I'm emphasizing maybe the perceived fermentation of that coffee, why would words like that not suffice as far as like what I put on the label?
Well, I think it's really interesting how, sort of what I mentioned with fermentation, as like now we're starting to pay attention to this thing that's been going on this whole time. And it's a way that we can signal to consumers that we're paying attention and saying, like, hey, I learned something and this is valuable, and so I want to name it. I think what is happening though is that we're a little too quick to name the thing, and we're kind of missing the point of what we're trying to say about it. So a lot of the times when we're trying to add labels to the fermentation, whether we're adding a double fermentation, or we're saying lactic fermentation or anaerobic fermentation or acetic fermentation, when we're trying to describe the fermentation itself, it's getting very specific, and it sounds really good. And I think it makes us feel good that we're valuing the product and we're paying attention to it. But like I mentioned, we're
Mm-hmm.
kind of paying attention to the wrong thing, because it's really hard to have a purely lactic fermentation or a purely acetic fermentation. There's so many microbes that are available in the environment that are acting at different times. And that's not really the point. The point is you're trying to say that you have a special coffee. And so I think that by labeling the fermentation in these ways that make us feel like we're getting closer to what makes this coffee special, we're actually getting further away from what does make the coffee special, which is, how it was grown and the people that grow it.
Mm.
So I feel very conflicted because my work focuses on fermentation and I want there to be more awareness on this subject, but I also see that I can be contributing to the problem in some ways. People want to label their coffee, yeast treated, and I
Yeah.
just don't think that the fact that it's a yeast treated coffee that had a 48-hour fermentation is more important than, the name of the person who grew it
Mm.
or how they're taking care of their land. And so, again, I feel like it's providing a distraction from what is really making coffee special.
Mm. I do want to take a step away from the broader conversation of fermentation, kind of head back to the coffee farm here, and talk about coffee ripeness. This is not something we've talked much about the show at all, with the exception of mechanized picking. I think we talked about a while ago in Brazil. What do you perceive are the challenges coffee farmers may unknowingly face when picking ripe cherries?
Well, I think there's, five main challenges. And the first one, I completely agree. I love that you've already spoken about mechanization in Brazil, because I think that is the biggest challenge, even more than climate change that coffee faces. Climate change is this huge, like, beast of a challenge for coffee farmers. But in some areas it's progressing much more quickly than in others, but I think that the slightly more pressing issue, the one that can, be here in a couple of hours, is a lack of labor. There are just not enough bodies to do the
Mm.
work of picking the coffee.
Yeah.
And like, so, a storm can come in over a couple of weeks or months, or, the temperature could change a couple of degrees per year, but your labor could not show up that morning, and then all of the coffee is going to sit on the trees and not be able to be picked. So that is the biggest challenge that I see producers facing. There is a lack of availability of bodies that can do the work and that even want to do the work. More of them are leaving the cities, etc. So that's just picking at all. But your question specifically about picking ripe is, I think mixed planting is quite an issue where you have red and yellow varieties next to each other. So it's hard to tell if you're picking a ripe yellow variety or if that yellow is an unripe red variety. It's very, very common. It's very common to have all of these, plants intermixed. And that gets into some complicated nuance because some of that is very good to have that, biodiversity of a lot of different plants. And when you have such a monocrop, it can be challenging for the environment, but it's also really good for picking. So it's like what's good for the environment is really hard for mechanization, processing, and standardization.
I didn't think about this, the variety aspect of different plants sitting next to each other.
And you also have the, not just like the color variety, that's a pretty obvious one where you have, that visual kind of trick. But different varieties would also have different windows where they become ripe. If you're interplanting, you're kind of staggering the ripeness window, and then you're making it even more difficult to pick.
Yeah. What a pickle to be in.
So I think, and then another one is bad information. It's very difficult when you have the proliferation of the bricks myth that producers should be picking cherries based on bricks instead of visually.
What is that? I'm not familiar. What is bricks?
Well, bricks is a measurement of sugar concentration generally used in the wine industry, or in beer you would use Plato. Okay. So to know that you have enough of a sugar concentration to do your fermentation. And so I see a lot of roasters, well-meaning roasters, who are trying to give their producers more tools and more information, giving out refractometers. And so you'll pick the cherry, you'll put a little drop on the refractometer, and then the light will refract what's in your sample. And then you'll say, okay, it's got 18 bricks. Exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
So that is a method that's used in a lot of other industries with fruit, and it's starting to be used more in coffee. And I think that is a bad direction. Bricks is like a whole other, 45-minute conversation of like why we need to untangle it. But that's really like inside baseball. It's not something that most consumers would be familiar with.
Right on. Okay. Well,
the fourth one, there's like so many like challenges to picking ripe. I would say cultural. It's really hard when you have a lack of incentive culturally. A lot of the pickers are indigenous people. And when you're saying, I'll pay you more money to pick riper cherries, because it takes an exponential amount of effort to pick only the red ripe cherries versus going to a coffee tree and kind of strip picking and just kind of picking whatever falls off. And it's so much more work. And you're saying, well, I'd like to pay you more for your effort, but that means that they need to have a society where they can spend that money. And if you're dealing with a lot of these indigenous communities, sure, maybe you can pay them 2, 3, 4, 5 times as much, but where are they going to go spend that money? That's not part of their cultures. Yeah. So who cares?
Yeah. Oh, geez. Yeah, there's no incentive. Like, even with more money doesn't mean much to them if it's not part of their way of living. Wow.
So then there's also a lack of incentive that's structural. So we in general, the coffee industry has been paying below the cost of production for decades. Yeah. And so that creates generations and generations that are in debt. And I found the situation where, because I work with coffee producers at their mills, they're trying to incentivize their workers, their pickers, to pick better coffee. But a lot of them are so deep in debt that even if you're offering so much money up front, it just really doesn't make a dent in the mountain of debt that they've had for generations, that they just like don't care. They're like, why would I work more? Like, this is just the method. And so it's really difficult for a lot of coffee producers to get ripe.
Yeah,
and those are just off the top of my head. I'm sure there's more.
I'm like, this is a whole nother even episode at this point, as far as, but I love how it ties into the conversation. You got to pick the coffee before it's fermented, and I know ripeness had a big impact on quality, or that's the way it seems to be. I want to move away from that conversation, now take another step in the coffee science conversation in the series. There's going to be a lot of talk about data. And my question to you, since you've worked so much with producers, would be, do you feel like you could discuss potential benefits of data to producers and what data would be valuable for them? And how should those insights on that data even be deployed or distributed to producers?
You can't improve what you don't measure. And so few coffee producers measure anything except weights, their yield, because yield is very important because that's how you make money. So you want to know how much the cherry weighs when it comes to your mill, and then you want to know your final yield of green coffee that is leaving the mill. We know that keeping track of numbers helps us improve. It's just what numbers to track. There's so many that you can, and that's one of the things that I see a lot of producers kind of getting into the weeds with, is that they start tracking everything and you create so much noise, and then it's hard to see the signal in the noise. And just tracking information isn't necessarily control, it's monitoring.
Right.
So I think a lot of people say they're controlling a fermentation, but they're just kind of monitoring when it starts and when it ends. There's not really a control element in that. So that's also kind of like my being a stickler for language. But because there are so many things that producers can measure, I think that it depends on how much resources you have, either mental capacity or actual bodies to be able to measure this data. But the very basic that I want my producers to start measuring is looking at their pH and looking at temperature, because these two elements, and this is only when I'm talking about processing. So, throughout the fermentation, but then also temperature and drying is really important. So I want them to look at these two elements because the temperature and the pH will give you a really good idea as to the type of microbes that are present and can help you with repeatability. So if you are ending your fermentation at, let's say, a pH level of 4, so pH will usually start around 6 or 7 because they'll be mostly, they use a lot of water to depulp and to fill the tank and things like that. So your starting pH is usually around 7 wherever you are.
Okay. Yeah.
And then over time, as the yeast and bacteria are active, they're producing acids. They are producing some lactic acids and acetic acids, and that's where some of those names come from for naming the bags or naming the coffee lots. And as they're producing acid, they are reducing the pH, right? It's becoming more acidic, so the pH is dropping. So if you as a coffee producer can end your fermentation at the same pH level, then you're going to have some amount of control over that consistency, versus the traditional method is just time. Is like the coffee comes in the morning, we ferment it overnight, and the next morning we wash it. And that will give very different results because some days are really hot, some days are chilly, some days it's raining, sometimes it hasn't rained for several weeks, and that's going to change what's going on in the tank. So sometimes, these are a lot of different ways that you can start to get that consistency, which I think has been one of the reasons why we've had this like proliferation of coffee hunters and this idea of like going out and finding these gems of coffee, because we've just accepted that coffee is inherently volatile and that we have to seek out these particular lots. But it doesn't have to be that way at all if we just, monitor some simple metrics and then get that repeatability.
Yeah, you hit on so many things that I think are worth pondering longer, all the way down to motivation. Like if I'm a coffee producer and I'm in debt because I haven't been making money because of the C price and being below the cost of production for a while, like my motivation to buy tools to measure is not going to be very high, probably without some like concrete, reliable benefit, a return on my investment. That's worth pondering, I think.
Well, and there's one thing that I've really been struggling with lately that deals with that, where it's like we've had this awareness that we haven't been buying coffee very ethically over the last several decades.
Yeah.
And people want to change that. And we want, we're getting more awareness of coffee prices, and we want to pay producers more, and we want to kind of correct some of these previous wrongs. But what I've seen in this space is that we acknowledge we haven't been doing a good job of paying for these prices, but then our kind of response or our solution to this problem is, okay, specialty coffee. Then let's get out of this commodity market. Let's make the coffee more special, and then we'll pay you more. And I feel like there's just like this jump in logic from we haven't been paying you enough, so
Yeah.
what we're going to do now is have you do
Yeah,
more
demand
and
higher
then we'll pay you.
quality and then we'll pay you. Yikes.
You
Oh.
So
Yeah.
this really bothers me that we're asking producers to do these like acrobatic, processing methods, and that's the only way that they'll get paid more, even though we haven't been doing a good job previously. So
Yeah.
all of these things of
Mm-hmm.
measuring more data, doing longer fermentations, adding yeast or adding bacteria, it's like all of this stuff is like additive. And this is like my personal viewpoint is more of a minimalist. I try to help my clients do less. I'm like, how many steps can we remove? How can we make this
Wow.
easier?
Okay.
How can
Yeah.
we cut your cost of production in half instead of extending it and trying to, impress somebody with how like long and extended this fermentation was.
Yeah. There's a lot to think about here, and we're coming to the closing questions. And so my brain is turning on a lot of stuff, but I'm going to try to push forward here. What value do you think coffee science adds to the coffee chain, kind of specifically from your perspective? What values do you see for what players or what stakeholders?
Oh, this one's good. This is a little bit tough, and it goes towards what we were talking about just now, where I'm not sure that a lot of coffee producers are benefiting from science. And I don't personally think that we need more science at this moment to improve coffee quality. Most of the science that I use in my work when I go to work with my producers, these are basics that have been known since the 1930s. So there's enough very basic science that if we just applied it, would make a dramatic improvement on coffee quality and how we do processing.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
this is like again a place where I think science can be like a distraction. It's like shiny and sparkly and like really cool, but it's not really solving the problems that we have today. So more science isn't going to solve the problem of not paying enough or not paying the cost of production.
Mm.
Like I don't know why we need more science to tackle that. I think that the issue is not a lack of science, but a lack of accessibility or disseminating that
Mm.
information. I
Yeah.
think if most producers had the information from the 1930s, they could do a really good job because in the 1930s, they were already using yeast cultures to monitor the fermentation. There's a patent from the 1940s where big companies were trying to use yeast cultures as their proprietary method of improving coffee quality
Yeah.
because they knew it was so powerful. And part of that patent process is keeping it proprietary. But we've known that this is a very powerful tool that's very simple, right? So buying a starter yeast could cost a couple of cents per pound, maybe 4 to 5 cents per pound. It's less than the cost of using like a grain pro bag when you're exporting coffee.
Okay.
And it has so many benefits, and yet very few people know about it. Like it's so simple. It's such a
Yeah.
simple technology.
It's really discouraging, honestly, to think that I've talked before. I don't know if it was on the show or not about extension programs, and I don't know if that language was new to me. But you see it in Colombia with the FNC, where they have these extension programs, which basically are educational resources and a scientific kind of center where producers tap into that, and they have access to that information, and there's sort of a collaboration happening. And I would bet that's just not true across borders. There's not that kind of infrastructure for producers.
Absolutely. Where coffee has thrived, and I think thrive, I'll put in quotations, or where coffee's been a little bit more successful for farmers, I think is places where there's strong governmental support. So comparing, Guatemala's government really put a lot of effort behind supporting farmers, giving them seeds
Mm-hmm.
for better or worse,
Mm-hmm.
but they did versus their neighbor, Honduras. The government did not put as much effort into the coffee program there, and we can see that in the prices reflected for what people are willing to buy their coffee for.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that not only that is that lack of support kind of structurally, but most of the information that I've seen, because of the way that coffee has been rewarded, it's been rewarded for volume and yield. And so most of the guidelines that I see that are available are really reinforcing that ultimate goal. There's very few resources that I've seen available that are looking at how to help producers produce quality, because that's a very new thing that we're rewarding. We only started rewarding quality, in this manner, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, maybe less,
Yeah.
for the
Yeah.
specialty sector. And so I guess that's something that doesn't exist. But again, that's not something that we need science for. These are, it's looking at the same information with fresh eyes. We already know how to reward volume, but what can we do to reward quality?
I guess the question here then is sort of, the science is there, so how do we mobilize that science or mobilize that knowledge and get it into the hands of producers without it costing them more when they're already taking on too much of the risk in the first place?
Exactly. And that creates this paradox or this tension where you can get into this like white savior territory of like, I'm going to bring you all the tools, I'm going to bring
Right.
you the information. And when that happens, like when it necessarily has to come from the outside, from consumers, from first world countries, it has to come back to these producing countries, then you're trying to empower people, you're trying to give them information, but you still hold all the power. And so
Right.
what you're doing is still reinforcing this, power
Yeah,
imbalance
it's like a
by
dependency
trying.
on. It's
Yes.
it's like you. If I was a producer, I'd feel like I was dependent on the person who's purchasing my coffee, which would generate a ton of fear in me, right?
Yeah,
To
and a
make
conflict of interest.
yeah, and a very serious conflict of interest. Yeah.
And that's what we're creating.
Uh-huh.
And then we're patting ourselves on our back saying we're doing good, we're helping coffee producers. But I'm like, but you're just perpetuating the power imbalance that got them in the situation in the first place.
Yeah. It's a complex issue, clearly, because we're trying to unravel major trespasses of dignity, I think.
Absolutely. I don't think that's, I think that's very, very accurate. And I think that what I see for the most part from the industry is people are becoming aware of that. We're trying to do better, but the method of trying to do better is to make the current system a little bit better, like the best version of the current system. And I think the problem is the system as a whole.
Yeah.
And so it's, we don't need this system to work better. We need a completely different system.
Yeah.
And I don't think enough people are doing that.
Well,
I'm trying in my little way from my fermentation tanks. Like I'm
yeah. No, yeah, I can tell. I can tell. Well, let's go ahead. We're going to pivot here. I'd like to hear about what you're working on. What is Lucia working on? And do you have any recommended resources on this topic for our listeners?
Yeah, I have most of my business, because I work with coffee producers, is B2B. I don't have that much exposure or contact with coffee consumers, just maybe, friends or family who drink coffee. So most of my resources are really for coffee producers. And what I have are several videos on my website where I go into the specifics of what to monitor, what your tank looks like, how to keep it clean, how to know what yeast or bacteria is actually acting there. And then if you want to, I work with using starter cultures, because that can be really easy. So I think of starter cultures as like training wheels. So it's something that you can learn to use so that you can be really comfortable and confident riding your bike, and then you can get rid of them. So I think a lot of people think that if I start using yeast cultures, I either have to keep going or that they're going to overtake my native population and I'm going to have a problem. So that's not the case. So I have these videos for producers, but I've heard from some roasters and also just coffee enthusiasts who are just interested in learning about what a coffee producer has to think about and what some of their challenges are, and hopefully that they reconsider when they ask them to change a process, when they ask Guatemalan producers to make natural coffees. That's very much a trend that I've been seeing, and I don't think it's a very good one. And I think it mostly just comes from well-meaning but lacking full information of a coffee producer's reality. So if you have a little bit more understanding of what their challenges are, even our conversation earlier about picking ripe, you'll be a little bit more conscientious when you ask for a certain process. So
Yeah.
videos, as you mentioned, thank you. I do have a podcast where I try to explore some of these topics. That I try to have that be a little bit more science specific and talking about these studies or a way to look at coffee science that already exists. Not too much cutting edge, because again, that's not what's interesting to me or what I think is really going to make the biggest difference in the industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I have a newsletter where I announce the episodes. It's a very infrequent newsletter. It's about twice a month, but I have a little bit more background into what I've been up to. And sometimes I also share, people are interested in these coffees. They want to try yeast treated coffees,
Yeah.
Or coffees that I've worked on with my producers. So
Cool.
that's where I'll usually say, talk to this person, or this is where you can find it.
Super cool.
And
yeah.
And I didn't even tell you where to get that. So my newsletter is on my website. You can sign up, and that's luxia.coffee, and it's LUXIA.coffee.
Very cool.
What I want people to walk away with is I hope that more people question where their coffee comes from and ask themselves if their values reflect what they are purchasing. So, for example, are you purchasing an anonymous coffee, or does the company, can you look into it and do they have some traceability about where this coffee came from? Do they know the name of the producer? Do they know the region? Do they know anything about? And again, I think that's more important, where it came from, than putting some label on, okay, this is a lactic process. I hope that more of us start to question more supply chains. So not just coffee, but where are spices coming from? Who's making our clothes? I think that we have this responsibility as consumers to say, how are we voting with our dollars?
Yeah.
And can we make a better choice? And most of the time it's yes, there are people who are really trying to, source well, and can we support them?
All the links Lucia mentioned to her podcast, Making Coffee with Lucia Solis, and her website are going to be available on thecoffeepodcast.com on this episode. So feel free to go to the website and check out those resources. If you ever have a hard time finding something you heard about on the show, feel free to also go to our website and email us or contact us and ask, hey, I couldn't find this resource. We'd be more than happy to supply that for you. In the coming Coffee Science podcast episodes, expect conversations about brewing and coffee health. Thanks for tuning in. And as always, and until next time, happy brewing.